Thank you, Elżbieta, for the very kind introduction. Immediately after the election, a friend of mine sent me a note. It was one of those Facebook posts, and probably some of you got it as well, because it was one of those viral Facebook posts. It was a bookstore somewhere in western Massachusetts. And the day after the election, they said, post-apocalyptic fiction will now be put in the current events section. And underneath it she wrote, "John, this is great news for your book." I said, "Great news for my book, bad news for the planet." And that unfortunately has been kind of constant feeling that I've had ever since the election, as I've watched some of the events that I talk about in my book unfold. I didn't predict that the UK would withdraw from the European Union and the infamous Brexit vote. I did not predict that Donald Trump would win the election in November. But as Elżbieta said, I was looking at these larger trends that I thought, and I wrote a piece about this, I thought would hit us circa 2020. I thought that was going to be the big election, not 2016. I mean, like you, perhaps, I was looking at the polling data all the way up till 2 o'clock in the morning of election day, thinking, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. I don't understand. I'm having cognitive dissonance between what I'm hearing and what I'm seeing. So I didn't expect it to happen in 2016. I expected that there would be, that the folks who were saying that they were supporting Donald Trump were not going to go away. They were not saying they're going to leave the country. They weren't going to go to New Zealand if Hillary Clinton was elected. They were going to stay. And they were going to be angry. And angrier. And more people get angrier and angrier until 2020 would be this huge outburst. So, I was 4 years off. So I was wrong there. But here, with this dystopian fiction, perhaps I've been a little bit more acute. I'm going to read just a short selection because, number one, it's a short book.
Yeah.
And number two, my editor is here, Tom Engelhardt, and I had to promise him I wouldn't read too much of it in order to get him to come, because of course he's labored over this prose. He doesn't want to hear too much of it again. So I'm just going to read a little bit from the book, and then we'll have a discussion about some of these themes. And then there are books for sale, and there's also a DVD of one of my performances, not the one that Elżbieta saw in which I played my mother, which is always interesting, but a different performance of being in Poland in 1989 when I worked there during the rise of...
We all buy it.
Yeah.
We all buy it.
And so I played 7 different characters in that performance as well. Okay. Introduction. Up on the roof. More than 25 years ago, as I sat on the roof of our house, watching the neighborhood's furniture float down the street, I thought things couldn't get any worse. Everything I owned was underwater. The capital of my country was ruined. Mother Earth was exacting its revenge upon its most arrogant inhabitants. As it turned out, things got a lot worse. If anyone should have anticipated the world's vertiginous descent into chaos, I was the most likely candidate. I was the author of Splinterlands, a best-selling book on the fracturing of the international community that made Julian West a household name among the more discerning households at any rate, and launched an entirely new field. That book also led chattering classes to dub me dismissively Professor Chicken Little. True, I'd been warning people that the sky was about to fall. I just didn't think it would fall on me. No one predicted that the extreme weather event known as Hurricane Donald would flood Washington, D.C. and its surroundings in 2022. I'd gone to sleep the night before expecting at worst high winds and heavy rains, I was roused from sleep by sirens and rapidly rising waters. My wife, fortunately, was on a business trip in Chicago. My children were safely abroad. It was dawn, and I'd woken to a nightmare. From my second-floor window, I could see a river sweeping down our suburban street. My car had already disappeared beneath the roiling brown water. Behind me, I could hear something lapping against the stairs. The river, I soon discovered, had already claimed the first floor. I entertained the idea of diving in to retrieve my wallet and my computer, both of which I'd foolishly left downstairs. I quickly scotched that idea. They weren't salvageable, and they didn't have time. There was no place to go but up. I grabbed my phone, put on 2 more layers of clothes, and climbed out onto the roof. The chimney provided a small measure of shelter from the wind and water. From this precarious perch, I could see other families huddled on their roofs. We looked like a flotilla of refugees, our chimneys as masts in a storm. My neighbors held tightly to their most precious possessions, Grandma's walker, a small safe, the family dog. Virtually all these things, including the dog, would eventually be left behind. There just wasn't room in the boats that finally came to get us. "This is the end," a young woman kept repeating to no one in particular as we huddled in the fishing skiff commandeered by the Coast Guard. Rain lashed her face. She clutched her laptop to her chest as if it were a flotation device. "This is the end, and everything has gone to shit." Just as those who don't live in the Arctic North lack a sophisticated vocabulary for describing snow, we hadn't yet found the words for the catastrophes about to befall us. For the time being, shit would have to do. Soon we would see the collapse of everything we considered so stable: the European Union, multi-ethnic China and Russia, and eventually the United States itself. We would be visited by an almost biblical succession of plagues, disease-bearing mosquitoes, killer robots run amok, the perils of too much and too little water. Even our genes turned against us with multiple mutations that we unwittingly passed to future generations like defective holiday gifts. I don't want to diminish the impact of Hurricane Donald. Several thousand people died. The economic toll ran into the hundreds of billions of dollars. The U.S. Capitol moved to Kansas City. This was nothing compared to what came next. And still, we haven't come to the end. Back in 2022, I sat on my roof and contemplated death for the first time. I had no confidence that the government or private charities would marshal the necessary resources in time to rescue my neighbors or me. I'd already watched as 3 privateers rode by offering their services at a price. I had no cash or credit cards on me, and they didn't accept promises of future payment. I don't remember any such stories during Hurricane Katrina in 2005, or even the Great Oregon Tsunami of 2019. But that's what was becoming of us. Homo homini lupus. By the time the last of these mercenaries disappeared from view, the water had risen just above my gutters. My neighbors atop their 3-story houses were miserable in the driving rain, but they could hold out longer. Those of us with 2-story houses were beginning to eye the flotsam that drifted past as possible rafts of last resort. I heard the voice through the bullhorn before I saw the Coast Guard skiff. It sounded to me like the voice of God. The rain continued mercilessly, but for me, that voice was the rainbow sign, and that skiff, the ark of salvation. I thought that the worst was over, that the darkness was lifting. How wrong I was. I'd forgotten that even as God was offering hope with his rainbow and dove, he also made a veiled threat if mankind did not change its errant ways. No more water, God promised Noah and the survivors. But remember, fire next time. Thank you. So I'll do a couple.
Oh, this is working good. So as also we have to mention, John and I have a history. from overlapping at the World Policy Institute, which was here at the New School for 15 or 16 years. It's now independent. And they actually co-sponsored and helped promote this. I don't know if anybody's here from World Policy, but I do appreciate that. I wanted to start with a little bit of a plug for Tom Dispatch, which I believe how it worked. You did an essay on this theme, and then Tom encouraged you to write a book. And did he say it should be a novel, or he just said write a book?
He said write a book.
Okay, so
he's hands off. he's a man of ideas, and he lets us run.
That's been my experience. You can have a short talk with Tom and get a whole idea for an article in short order. So anyway, I wanted to contrast something Tom wrote with something Hannah Arendt said, which she has a history, had a history with the New School as well. This is from an old issue of New York Review of Books, which was online. You can't get any of her books now because they're all sold out, so you have to go online. But anyway, it's about totalitarianism. And she says, totalitarianism begins in contempt for what you have. The second step is the notion, things must change no matter how. Anything is better than what we have. And this is something Tom said in October, which was in PT, pre-Trump era. He said, think of it another way, and it may be the newest way of all. A significant part of the white working class, at least, feels as if, whether economically or psychologically, its back is up against the wall and there's nowhere left to go. Under such circumstances, many of these voters have evidently decided they're ready to send a literal loose cannon into the White House. They're willing, that is, to take a chance on the roof collapsing, even if it collapses on them. So you see there's parallels there. But as for John, my first question is, why did you do this to us? You know, you wrote this thing, it happened, and I think you have a responsibility to write a new book that fixes it. And as a beginning, you know, do you see any currents in the midst of this admittedly dark time that could get us out of this mess in some fashion? I know that's a big question, so whatever aspects of it you feel like talking about.
Thanks, Bill. I mean, it does have the ring of a Stephen King novel, you know, in which the author begins to observe that what he or she is writing takes place, and therefore has this responsibility to be very careful with this newfound power. I, of course, as I said, didn't anticipate that these things would happen, and so therefore this was supposed to be a warning sign. This was supposed to be, okay, we have the continuation of the European Union, there's some tensions, okay, but it's, you know, you still have this kind of entity, fractious entity that's limping along. We have a Hillary Clinton presidency, not everyone's so happy about it, but nevertheless, both in the United States and in Europe, you have, you know, what Poles called in Poland, Poland B. There's Poland A and Poland B. Poland A did reasonably well as a result of the changes after 1989. Poland B, not so much. And when it came time for Poland B to have a voice at the polls, Polish polls at the elections, Poland B had their revenge. And their revenge was to put into power a party, again, I mean, it had been power briefly earlier in this century, but a party that was quite radical in its vision. And if you looked at a map, an electoral map of Poland in the last elections, it was, you know, virtually all the country was covered in voters for this conservative, radical Christian party, except for a couple of cities, just around urban, cosmopolitan areas. And despite this, and despite the fact that that pattern was repeated actually throughout the region, you could see that electoral pattern in the support for Fidesz in Hungary, and the support, and it wasn't a matter of left or right, because for instance, in Slovakia, you had the same kind of pattern but for a left populist, representing the voices of people left behind, who had not taken advantage or been able to take advantage of the changes over the last couple of decades. Despite that, despite this evidence, despite the electoral map around the Brexit vote in the UK, here in the United States, we were confident that we were an exception. And I know Tom has written about this as well, about the last gasp of exceptionalism. And as you know, exceptionalism refers to our belief that we are just not subject to the same rules as the rest of the world, because, well, we're a big country, diverse, we're separated by a number of oceans from the old country. We have this brilliant constitution, et cetera, et cetera. There are all these kind of factors that make us exceptional. But I think deep down we believe that ultimately our democracy or democratic traditions or the native American genius, our capacity for civil society, what de Tocqueville wrote about, everything from the 18th century to today would save us from what other countries were experiencing. And we learned brutally that that was not the case. We are not an exception to the rules. So, what am I going to write to get us out of this? Well, ultimately, I do think we will, if we look in the long term. I mean, obviously we're not going to get out of this next week. Okay, we have seen some resignations, we've seen some blocked confirmations, but I don't think we're going to have this, magic moment that's going to happen in a month in which, the Trump administration just says, sorry, we were joking, and they step down and get reasonable politicians. I think, in fact, that we may have difficulty in the midterms, and we may even have difficulty 4 years from now, especially at the Electoral College level. But thinking long-term, the silver lining, of course, is that two things. One, the amount of activism that has been encouraged or has come into being as a result of this election, whether it was the immediate protest after the inauguration, or the protests at the airports, or any number of protests that have taken place in town meetings in some pretty conservative places, at representatives' meet and greets in Utah and Colorado. So all of that suggests that people are pissed and they're not going to take this sitting down. Okay, so that is optimistic. More generally, I would say that we are questioning our assumptions about what liberalism means. In other words, I think for the better part, well, certainly since the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's been a kind of default position about unexamined concepts and principles related to our version of liberalism. That it would just it was kind of like the clockwork universe of the deists. Once set into motion, it would continue, and you actually didn't need God to interfere in history. The clockwork of the universe would just continue. And so the clockwork of American liberalism would just continue without any intervention. And we realized, well, actually it does need not only intervention, but a pretty profound rethinking. That the default of a Clinton dynasty just is not going to cut it. So that, I think, over a longer period is positive. What I end with in this book is the closest thing to a silver lining. This is I mean, if you don't like depressing books, I know I shouldn't tell you that you should buy it regardless, but this is great.
I don't remember a silver lining.
Okay, there was a footnote. So there's
There's
a,
somebody survived who's editing your book or
That's
something.
right.
Yeah.
so there is the ex-wife of the main character joins a commune, basically, called Arcadia, which is located in the northeast kingdom of Vermont, way up north where Howard Frank Mosher sets his novels. And this is, it's not like, look, it's not utopian, okay? I mean, these folks are, okay, the growing season's better because of climate change and they have a great citrus crop. But aside from that, there are a lot of challenges that they have to deal with, and so they're pretty well armed, okay? So that gives you some indication that this is not like, Haight-Ashbury circa 1967. But still, there is a kernel there that I will be dealing with. I mean, one of the articles Tom published immediately after the election was the perspective of that character, the ex-wife, writing about the elections and looking at American history from 2016 on. And so I am kind of playing with that as a sequel that would be, okay, if this is 99% grim and 1% hopeful, that would be 92% grim and 8% hopeful. And then if we get to the point of a third book, then the balance would start shifting in the other direction, and I can then inhabit that Stephen King role more faithfully, in which I create this much more hopeful present out there.
Well, we're going to hold you to that third book, so maybe you should write it second.
Yes, this is the third book second.
This is my last question, and actually, Elzbieta and Jeff probably have a better feel for it than I do, but one of the things you've written about and worked on is the transitions to democracy in East and Central Europe. And you've talked to people who are part of that recently about how they see what's happened since. And one thing that's occurring to me is we could probably learn a lot from people who have organized in the context of authoritarian regimes. So are there things that happened during the Democratic Revolution in East and Central Europe or since that time that could inspire us or we could adopt or maybe start a dialogue with people about how they're organizing? I guess that's my question.
So, thanks to the Open Society Foundation, I had a chance to go back to Eastern Europe and re-interview people that I had interviewed in 1990. So I tracked down about, well, all told, 300 people I interviewed. Maybe a third of them were people I had talked to in 1990 to see how their perspectives had changed over a 25-year period. Talked to a couple other people, like Dan and Elzbieta here in New York. And then this book will come out, as Elzbieta said, later this year. In terms of hopeful, I'll give two examples. One is Slovakia. So, as you probably remember, Czechoslovakia split, but in what was called the Velvet Divorce. They had the Velvet Revolution in 1989, and then the two countries, more or less amicably, although it wasn't exactly it wasn't participatory, it was a decision by the two leaders to cut the country in half, Czech Republic and Slovakia. So Slovakia became an independent country in 1993. One of the leaders, Vladimir Mečiar, gradually, or it depends on your perspective, maybe rapidly, consolidated power in a democratic way as a populist. I mean, he's a populist very in the same mold as Donald Trump. And he was a former boxer. He deliberately included typographical mistakes in campaign literature to demonstrate that he was a man of the people. And so he took power democratically, but he consolidated that power in very opaque and in many ways undemocratic ways, so that Slovaks who had participated in the democratic changes in 1989 were like, wait, what happened? We had this revolution and now we have this guy? This is totally unacceptable. And you Czechs have Václav Havel, like he's a playwright, he's really cool, we like him. And all we got is this guy? This is what we get? You know, like that t-shirt, we had a revolution and this is all we get? Betcha? But what people told me afterwards was that, well, honestly, because our revolution was velvet, and because it lasted so quickly, it happened so quickly, we Slovaks, I mean, we participated, but we didn't have the same kind of profound transformation, say, happened in Poland, where you have this mass movement that transformed the country. Nor did we have a kind of gradual evolution of civil society as happened in Hungary. And we didn't even have like the excitement of killing our leader, as the Romanians did. So we got none of that, okay? But now that we have this doofus in power, this reminds us of what we can do as citizens. And that, for many people in Slovakia, was their real revolution. It wasn't 1989. It was the period between roughly 1995 and when they ousted him, more or less a couple of years later, 1998 or so, in the elections. This was a kind of latent civil society that became a parent civil society, a civil society that, how they put it, grew up, okay? Extraordinary experience for so many people. And I think that there's a parallel for us there. I mean, we too, in some sense, have a latent civil society, but a civil society that has forgotten how to change a country in a profound way. I mean, we've been, and you know, I live in DC, so I'm guilty of this more than anyone. We have focused on the little things, you know, changing a little language here in this bill or a little language in that bill, and we've forgotten the larger picture. Because that's one story. The second story is a smaller story, but it's about an artist who I thought was a really interesting artist. And many of the people I interviewed in the region, they talked about transformative experiences as activists, but also as artists. It was very interesting seeing what artists had to say. So this guy had, he was in Republika Srpska, which is the kind of Serbian, ethnic Serbian section of Bosnia. And he'd been conscripted to serve in the Bosnian Serb army after the war had already ended, after the conflicts in Yugoslavia, the 3 to 4 wars, it ended by 2000. So he served somewhere between 2001 and 2003. And he had an opportunity to continue. He could have stayed in the army and risen, but he didn't really want to do that. He wanted to go to art school. And now everybody thought that was crazy. I mean, here in Republika Srpska, there's no real art scene. I mean, maybe in Sarajevo, certainly in other parts, but here, no. But when he finished and applied for art school, it turned out that they turned the military base that he had been serving in into the art school. Like they needed an art school, and they turned that into the art school. So he ended up being in the same place that he had been during the army. So he's like, huh, this is interesting. So he did, for his senior thesis, his project was called I Serve Art. And he basically took the same period of time that he served in the army, and he served art instead. And each of the things he did, every day he did something different on the campus, and much of the campus was still kind of not used because they were only using a couple of buildings for the art school. He reclaimed for art. Like he would do what amounted to sentry duty, but he would be serving art. He was like going to areas of the campus and detoxifying them for art's sake. And the other project, which I remember, he did target practice, but he would have the silhouette, and instead of shooting the person in the heart, which is what you're supposed to do, or the head, he would outline the person with bullets and would create actually a portrait. So he was creating a person rather than destroying a person. And this was, for him, an interesting experiment, but for me, it really was like a signpost for all of Republika Srpska. This is how we as a society can leave this heavily militarized past of ours behind and find meaning in the same place. It's not like we're going to move to New Zealand. We're still going to be here. But we have to take what we have here and transform it. We have to look at it differently and transform it.
All right, I'm done. So I'd like to talk to you about your art and about the form of the work. So it's a dystopian novel that seems to be a projection of the present and its negative aspects into the future, exaggerated, maybe not exaggerated. Maybe the exaggeration has turned out not to be as great as you had anticipated or had understood when you were doing it. But I wonder why you turned to this form, and I want to note that it's in some ways as a fiction, it's somewhat, in some ways, a post-factual reality. And I worry about it just as I worry about post-factual politics. I mean, meaning it now has a great authority because of what has happened, but I wonder if it's it somehow doesn't only open up possibility, but it also suggests that things are more closed than they actually are.
Perhaps it's performance. It's good to perform it, but that's bad.
Well, that's a good question. First, let me answer the first part, and then I'll answer the second part. So why a novel? And we talked a little bit, I wrote this essay that is basically the first chapter of this book for Tom Dispatch, and it was, and Tom and I were talking, and I said, well, I'm thinking of doing something about the future of U.S., European, Russian relations, kind of what the big picture, how it's going to change. And then, after I got off the phone, I realized big picture might not be the right expression, because my impulse is to imagine that the big is going to continue to be big and get bigger. That these entities that we think of as being givens, whether it's the United States or the EU or Russia, they may not be givens. And if they're not givens, well, what does that mean? What if you do pull the little thread of the international tapestry and it starts to unwind? What implications does that have? So I wrote the essay, and then Tom said, well, why do you think about putting it into a book? And I said, well, yeah, I accept it. Why would someone turn a page? I mean, it's tough to read nonstop, say, speculative nonfiction if there's no driving reason for you to continue to turn the page. So I thought, well, okay, if you have a world falling apart, but it's mirrored by a family that's falling apart, and you have to understand why, try to solve the mystery of both of those things, then there can be a reason to turn the page. So fiction is useful for that. And I mean, in the back of my mind, of course, what Elżbieta began with, that you can have very powerful images and very powerful metaphors in a fictional universe that can have, in some ways, at least as much explanatory, if not more explanatory power than if I were simply to try to describe it in a non-fiction way. Now, post-factual. Of course, living in DC, we are all very much concerned about the post-factual because, of course, some dude out in the West reads a story about a child pornography ring at a pizza place that I particularly like, and decides he's going to go and free everybody who's locked in the basement, except he gets there and there's no basement, and there's no ring, and it's completely fabricated. In other words, there is this fiction that is out there that is taken over people's imagination to a certain extent. And
And I have to say that, can I just
Please?
jump
No.
in? Okay, so, no, because I'm also incredible, everybody knows that, sucker for hope. So it is difficult to read something like that. But what I took from that is the fact that your character, the main character, Julian West, is that 10-year professor, is actually an intelligent and well-informed man who worries too. And what I liked about it is that actually it is not post-factual. We are learning, that something that happened around 89, and that Hartung was wrong. We can read in the footnotes when he said the time of nationalism is over, because those new entities emerged, and now we know that even that smaller and smaller and smaller, and now we are at the point when Wallonia and Flandria are fighting with each other, right? And there was in America there was no America. So what I'm trying, but then there is this narrative. There is this narrative by him, which is this kind of which provides us with a large understanding, I think, how it happened. I actually do not think it's post-factual. But it is depressing.
When I say post-factual, I was actually thinking of Hannah Arendt. And the whole question about truth and politics and how lying is a part of politics, necessarily a part of politics, but systematic lying is absolute darkness. And fiction is actually a strange form. Some people say fact and fiction. Well, it's not really fact and fiction. Fiction is imagination. But on the other,
that's what she talked about.
yeah, absolutely, and we need imagination. But imagination of a kind of cliched sort, based on fear, is the horror that we face now.
Can I say something? Oh, go ahead.
Just one thing. So I have a solution for your book, how to make it more hopeful. Of course, now it's too late, but you can do it still in that. But there's also one thing about utopias, including dystopias, which somewhat is not there, which doesn't make me think that this is actually dystopia, really dystopia. It's too close to reality. Every utopian author set up a very thorough system of education that would reproduce it, maintain it, and and kind of write. So it would never end. Part of that is also this eternal, and I don't think it's there. That elements are there, and the other thing that. But you have those children, and none of them is a messenger of work. One could wonder, but one of them is completely into this kind of other kind of. None of them produces or collects or works. Those glimmers of hope. It's somewhat not there. So I would think that I would at least designate one of them to do that, and then we would be happy. We'd be happy. Or happier. Sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to talk to your question of despair. I was a little concerned about this event, even getting people here, because I thought, okay, what's the hook here? The world's going to hell, and here's a novel about the world going to hell slightly faster. Where's the payoff? But I did think if we could get people here, we could have an interesting conversation, which we are having. My own feeling about what's happened is, of course I alternate. Sometimes I want to curl up in a little ball, sometimes I'm angry, but I have been somewhat energized, I have to say. I spoke on the weekend at a peace event in Brooklyn, by Brooklyn for Peace, which is a wonderful group. But as many of us who have worked on peace issues for many years, it's diminishing returns. you know, you get 30 people out, you're happy. And it's an aging group. I'm often the youngest one in the room, and I'm now 61. So that in itself is a problem. Anyway, they drew 150 people, quite a diverse crowd, a lot of students, including a high school student from Staten Island who was organizing in her high school. And it was a broad-ranging discussion. People wanted to understand how the various issues interrelate, and they wanted to be effective. You know, they didn't just want to push a button on a move-on email. They were asking, well, how do we address this new situation? So that doesn't mean we're going to win, but there's at least a spark of hope. And then I guess my fallback position is, I have a friend who's a union organizer. And of course the union movement has taken it on the chin in recent years and is certainly up against it now. And some years ago, he described to me his theory of existential radicalism, which is kind of like I rebel, therefore I am, or I'm not going to give the bastards the satisfaction, or you know, something like that. And in a pinch, that's kind of my fallback. And then the fact that I'm just stubborn, you know, like I don't believe that we have to settle for this. And even when the facts don't really bear me out, like I'm not going to give up. And so, you know, it may be that may be a post-factual feeling also, but in the dark moments, it motivates me, or at least gets me out of bed in the morning.
Without giving away too much from the ending, there is a suggestion that the main character has made a mistake in his life, a pretty profound mistake, which has led to the disintegration of his family. And he, at the end, manages to learn from that mistake and do the right thing, basically. Now, of course, there was one person, his review was like, and then it was fine until this melodramatic ending. Like, he wanted 100% grim. And I gave, like, you know, this 1% he was unhappy. That's grim enough for him. So there is that at the level of individual action. You asked, what would I write if I started after the election? And of course, I would write, you know, a book of resistance. You know, I mean, writing a book last December was not the time of resistance. No one was thinking of resistance. Yeah, I mean, we were thinking of opposing this or that or this or that. We weren't thinking of like large-scale resistance. At the time, it seemed the most important thing was to kind of reveal what might happen. You know, and I was just wrong on the timeline. So if I were to write this particular book, again, it would be more about, and even the children, you know, resist in their own way. And certainly the wife resists in her own way. And one could argue that the main character does to a certain extent as well. I would have changed it, I would have put the emphasis on that. And it would, you know, I mean, I can still, one of the nice things about fiction is that, you know, you set up a kind of framework, and you just gesture in certain directions. You gesture in terms of character development, you gesture in terms of what the landscape looks like. You don't, especially in a book this short, you don't go into detail about what everything looks like and everybody's personality. And you hope that the reader fills it in. I mean, because that's what makes a novel exciting, is you as a reader are creating the world as much as the author is creating the world. But that also means that there's a lot of empty space that I can go in and say, well, actually, I know this is what I wrote, but there's a bigger picture. There's another story. And then it provides a kind of a subversive, and of course we already have subversive subtexts, the footnotes in this book, that undercut the story. But you can have an entire second volume that is subversive in that regard and tells a different story using the same characters without violating any of the laws of fiction.
I have one more thought on the issue of hope versus despair. I don't think it's in the book, but in the remarks you just made, you talked about how a lot of the groups we work with in Washington are kind of hyper-incremental. You know, it's like well, if we could just get this language in the subcommittee on homeland security, on a bill that may or may not pass, that would be a victory, you know. And in normal times, maybe there's a tendency to do that, but as you know, we're not in normal times. So I think it opens up the possibility of a much richer political discussion. And it's not clear to me that the kind of groups that I work with, that are nonprofits, you know, funded by foundations and wealthy individuals, are going to be in the vanguard of that. I think actually I could predict that they're not. But I think they have a role to play. And I think probably our role partly is to push the limits of what you can do in that form. But you know, you're not going to bring a political revolution out of a nonprofit. At most, maybe you can be helpful, you can supplement. But it's got to be a citizens movement that's self-sustaining in some way. And that to me is exciting, even given all the difficulties of doing that, of getting people on the same page, and strategizing, of people who haven't been politically active possibly ever, figuring out how to be effective in the world, heading off sectarianism and, you know, infiltration by the government, and who knows what. But I do think there's some energy here that can be channeled in a positive direction.
Is this the time to turn to the audience? So let's just do it. I will see you better from here. And please do, go ahead. Yes? And just let's introduce ourselves. I know that everybody knows you. No? No. Go ahead, yes.
I just wanted to respond a little on the thought that when the worst happens, or when you know what the worst might be, that does you in. You know, I think we've just seen the worst happen in some ways in our own world, and the very opposite has happened. I mean, people are completely, well, as Bill was saying, I mean, I was at the New York Women's March, and we didn't move for hours. You know, so I think, I mean, I've been fascinated by dystopian novels since I was a kid, and I think knowing the worst makes you feel, knowing the possible worst makes you feel that something needs to be done, and needs to be done fast. So that's my own. I don't think it works. I don't think dystopian novels work the way you suggest. Well, or at least the way you were suggesting to John, or
In a question.
in a question. And I wanted to ask you, John. You saw something having to do with I mean, the heart of the book is the effect of two forces: nationalism and climate change, really. But above all, nationalism, a force that seemed to have disappeared from the world with globalization. And you saw, I think, quite early that it was going to do something quite striking. It was going to fragment the planet, possibly. I mean, how far outside the novel in our lives now, how far do you see nationalism fragmenting the planet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, the irony, of course, is that nationalism, at its root, is about a consolidation of identity. It's about, you know, bringing people together under a rubric, a flag, a song, a story, a legend. It's supposed to be a consolidating force. And some people would argue, for instance, and a colleague and I wrote a book, or edited a book back in 1996, Europe's New Nationalism. So this was 1996, and we were looking at pretty much what we were talking about today, that even at this point in which people are talking about the European Union growing, about this new forces of globalization, that in the heart of Europe, where nationalism is supposed to be dead, it's supposed to be, all the horrors of World War I and World War II had been laid to rest by the European Union, and yet nationalism was arising back in the immediate aftermath of the changes of 1989 and 1990. And one of the contributors wrote that democracy is not possible without nationalism. That in fact, it's only when you have some consensus among people that you can have a democratic system operate. Because without that kind of assumed consensus based on, he argued, nationalism, people go off in all sorts of different directions. And you cannot have a functioning democratic system. You have secession, you have fragmentation, you have all of the things that the founding fathers worried about in terms of factionalism in American democracy. So that was one argument about nationalism as a consolidating feature. But all of that discussion took place at a different time, when the nation state was, shall we say, in a healthier condition. Since that time, the nation state has suffered a tremendous degree, or a tremendous erosion of power. It's delegated authority upwards to international institutions, and it's lost authority downwards through decentralization. And there's a great anxiety over the nation state itself, whether the nation state can still deliver the goods and services. I mean, if you have, as a result of neoliberalism, less of a government there than you had before, can people really count on it to give Social Security, health care, et cetera, et cetera? So great anxiety over whether the nation state can function effectively, as well as fear that the international community is not democratic and is not representative, and that our rights, our identity is being taken away by these faceless bureaucrats far, far away. So you add those things together, and nationalism takes on a very, very different character than what we were writing about in the mid-1990s. And if I look at where that will go, well, if I just want to be grim about it, I would say we face global challenges at the moment that require global responses, and the forces of nationalism are making it, frankly, very difficult to marshal the necessary global response to climate change, to nuclear proliferation, to pandemics, etc. Because that's the 100% grim side of things. On the more positive side, I would say we could talk about the reaction or the resistance to Trump. And that's fine, and I'm part of it, so I'm comfortable talking about it. But I think we also have to acknowledge that many of the people who voted for Trump, and also who supported kind of nationalist movements throughout Europe, there is a genuine concern there that they are not getting anything from international institutions and from the national economy. That the nation state and internationalism are not providing the goods to them. At root, one could argue that there is, in addition to the racism, the xenophobia, and all the other fear factor elements, there is a desire somewhere in there for greater democratic participation. That people want to have more control over their own lives. And that if we can speak, when I say we, I mean folks who are trying to build alternatives, if we can speak to that particular desire, as opposed to simply saying you're racist, you're xenophobic, etc. If we can say, look, I understand that the economy, the national economy has not benefited you. I understand that you have concerns about international institutions. And we want to have a more democratic country that involves you more. Maybe that can be a powerful narrative, a powerful story that we tell. And I've written that, frankly, I think that in order for kind of anti-Trump forces to win in 2 years from now and 4 years from now, to be honest with you, I do think there has to be a patriotic element to it. I think we have to say that Trump is anti-American. And not just that, we don't like what he does, but he's fundamentally violating American principles. And we are telling the American story. Our story is the American story. And I hesitate to call that nationalist. I mean, I prefer to call that kind of patriotic or even civil society version of political participation. But I do think using those terms and making those references is absolutely critical in forging a new alternative.
Can I say one thing about it? I've been fascinated with how certain people have been suddenly viewed as positively democratic. For example, neocons who got us into war in Iraq are suddenly arbiters of how government should operate. For example, the thing of Steve Bannon going on the National Security Council. There was a Bush guy on NPR saying, oh, we would never politicize national security. I was like, really? That's so good to know. Too bad you didn't think of it when you were running the country, you know. But anyway, on the issue of patriotism, Dick Cheney gave an interview to Hewitt, who was the guy who asked Trump the question about the nuclear triad, which he flubbed. But anyway, about the Muslim ban. And Cheney said, oh, that goes against everything we stand for and believe in as a nation. You know, George W. Bush actually said it's not about Islam, it's about terrorists. Ronald Reagan, under much pressure, granted, signed an amnesty for 3 or 4 million undocumented immigrants. So there is this weird thing where even on certain issues, people we would never work with might agree with us. I don't think we should let them become, you know, what comes next or the responsible alternative. But I think there may be some points of overlap that might be helpful. And I think some of it might be under a patriotic theme.
I think that this is something that book made me kind of think again, or kind of help me to think further, that we have to somehow merge those divides. The father was going merge or transcend or, you know, create a possibility for the splinters to kind of to come together. The divisiveness, it's a huge warning sign that we already know about it, but the whole book is about it. And the fact that the father decides if you're Jew or not, visit the family. You know, just, you know, to talk to them, to figure, you know, after, I mean, this is the kind of first way, and I think that that's something that we need to do. We have to talk to people that we really don't perhaps want to talk, or we don't agree with, but there is no other way. Or we face this Spliterlands. Andrzej Tymowski.
Okay.
American Council of Learned Society's old friend, so I know, so I pointed it out. And his name is
Yes, thank you. I have 2 questions. One is about Haymarket and one is about entropy. And I want to follow William Hartung's question. What's the hook? Well, I got a message from TCDS. Always interesting. There's a book, Splinterlands. It's a dystopian novel. Yeah, that's interesting. I looked it up. I said, Haymarket books? You gotta be kidding me. There's a book, perfect bound with pages, that's been published by an independent publisher, which is in Chicago, which calls itself Haymarket, a place where I took part in demonstrations. That's already something. So that brought me here, and I'm really glad I came because it, in fact, has fulfilled all of those hopes. Entropy. So in other words, if you could say something about Haymarket, that would fill in the picture, that would be great. Haymarket books. We've been talking about a great political clash between the forces of evil and the forces of, opposed to that evil. I think we're missing, or we haven't been talking about, at least today, what's really terrifying, and that is that Trump is not the political force of evil, but it's entropy. I mean, he got in there on a Hummer, and he doesn't know what he's doing, and it's going to radically fall apart in a way that the system is supposed to be able to take care of. There are all sorts of checks and balances and succession and all of this, but it's the radical uncertainty of what's going to go on, what's going to happen today. that, you know, when the counterintelligence of the United States has the president, I mean, they're looking, they're thinking of him as a spy. I mean, this is nuts, and it's nuts in a way that is, you know, it's entropy. I mean, so.
So yeah, I mean, one could argue that the book is the picture of entropy at an international level, in which everything falls apart, organization breaks down. In one section, the narrator says, we all thought that the arrow of history went in a certain direction, toward greater organization. But of course, that defies, to a certain extent, the laws of physics. And so, really, the arrow ultimately of history is going to go the other way, towards less organization, toward fragmentation. However, the purpose of a dystopia, as Tom pointed out, is to make us realize how precious certain things are. And that all of the effort that goes into creating a complex organization is valuable and worth the effort when we see it unravel. So that, I hope, again, is one of the messages. Haymarket's a great press. It's comes from that Haymarket tradition of, I mean, Haymarket itself no longer exists as a location in Chicago, where the anarchists had the famous incident in 1886. Yes. Just a small. Rob and I were studying in Russia in 1985. One of our colleagues, one of our classmates, came back after talking with Russians that day. And, those Russians, they lie all the time. Can you believe it? They said that May Day was like originally an American holiday. Those idiots. I said, well, actually it was. What? Interesting kind of post-factual experience.
Could you give the yes to your neighbor?
Can I say one thing about post-factual?
One of the questions I got over the weekend was, how do you deal with the world of alternative facts? And I studied the Pentagon, so it's been here for a long time. I mean, the lying about the Gulf of Tonkin to, justify the Vietnam War, the missile gap in the 1950s, Saddam Hussein having weapons of mass destruction. So it's not something we haven't faced before. It's more pervasive, and it's coming at us at a much more rapid clip. But we've dealt with the phenomenon in some sense, especially, I think, in issues of war and peace.
May I insist? I mean, this is actually one of the things I was trying to be provocative about. I really think that we're in a different, it's different. That there is systematic lying, and pervasive lying. It's not that there's a lie that was used to manipulate the population or to kind of move people in one, and then, but there, I didn't actually see it, but I heard reports on it. Apparently, our president had a press conference today.
Yeah.
Yes.
And the direct attack upon the press, and the fact that responsible journalists are vilified by saying fake news.
Yes.
To the point that people can't tell the difference between what is fake news and what's not fake news. And it just becomes a matter of where you are in the society, whether the label works or not. Whether it's meaningful to you just because of your political conviction. This is something really out of the ordinary. I also want to agree wholeheartedly about this idea of patriotism. The need to actually celebrate Bush when, if he joins in the consensus that we're living in a different order because there are partisan conflicts, and they're real, and there are people who are my opponents, but they're not my enemies. And a new form of totalitarianism or authoritarianism is upon us. The American Republic is actually at stake, and we have to actually focus upon it. You know, and labeling it un-American, I think, is actually an absolutely crucial move.
I'm glad you said that. That actually gets into what I was going to bring forward in my question. First of all, I'd like to thank the people for bringing out the fact that despair leads to action and not necessarily to crawling in a corner. Yeah, maybe alternate Tuesdays you do that, but it leads to action. And even high school students in Staten Island go way out of their way to ask the question, how do we act? What do we do? And it's not just pushing a button on the screen. Wendell Berry, who is a ecologist and radical, has a quote which I like, which is, "Action is the antidote to despair." A very pithy quote. One of the questions I wanted to ask John to address, he addressed patriotism in its bright mode and in its shadow mode. And patriotism in its shadow mode gave us the horrors of the 20th century. So, your thoughts, please, on how to do American patriotism which doesn't go there.
Big question. That's a big question, yeah. Well, you know, we always have an opportunity to define things as we want to define them. So if we define American patriotism in the Woody Guthrie, this land is your land, this land is our land way, as a tapestry, as a, you know, we emphasize the history that we want to emphasize. I mean, you know, we have to be honest. We have to say that, yeah, I mean, it's not like American history is full of nothing but nice things. But, you know, part of building a future is constructing the narrative, constructing the story that you think is going to be a powerful story to bring us forward. And by emphasizing the things you think need to be emphasized, that's, you know, there's no guarantee. There's no guarantee that someone's going to say, well, I like this, but I also like this negative part too. You know, I want Woody Guthrie, but I also don't want, you know, Mexican immigrants. But it's not like there's one conversation. It's what this kind of patriotism is a succession of conversations. The conversations that Elżbieta was talking about. And in some sense, what your book, you know, the conversations that took place in Poland that led up to the roundtable negotiations. I mean, these were a set of nested conversations that took place throughout society and at all levels, leading all the way up to the top. And they have to be inclusive. And that emphasis on inclusivity, you know, that everyone belongs at the table, that everyone's voice should be heard. I mean, that's, I guess,
That's also controversial right now.
it is controversial. I mean, yeah, I can't give you a better answer.
Many of us have bought books, and we would like John to sign them. We want to be this very special and exclusive book which will have your signature. And I only wanted to add that I also absolutely agree with that sense that that we do have to feel proud and patriotic. But we also needed to, and we have to name it, we use this word, we also have to point out that it's not just dangerous, but that that the context in which we seem to be living is an increasingly autocratic, and we also have to use this word, authoritarianism and autocracy, because otherwise lies will prevail, right? So I think we'll just invite you. In the first place, thank you very much.